right, y'all. So I think we're gonna go ahead and get started here. Uh, Hello and welcome. My name is Tony Fazzino, and I am the Trap Support Specialist here at Brig. The webinar here today is Wildlife and Land Use, Navigating Wild Pig Impacts this Fall. So before we begin, I'd like to just cover a few things real quick. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available here in the next coming weeks. If you have any questions during the webinar, just go ahead and pop them in the Q&A widget here, and we will go ahead and answer those at the end of the webinar. All right, so Aaron Sumrall is our Director of Research, Education, and Outreach, and he's going to kind of be driving the webinar here today, and he's going to go ahead and introduce the rest of the crew. You have all of our attention, Aaron.
Good deal, Tony. I appreciate the intro. Yeah, tonight what we're going to do is our special guest tonight is Robert Sanders. Robert is the Director of Forest and Wildlife Management at Boggy Slough. He's a biologist. He is passionate about native whitetail management and has got just a wealth of knowledge about what to do on the landscape, how to respond to different situations that are presented. Robert lives in Apple Springs, Texas. If some of y'all may know where that's at, y'all are East Texas people for sure, because that's about the entering and leaving signs on the same post. So whenever you start thinking about where he's at there, that's a pretty small area of the world. It's about, I don't know, a few miles outside of Lufkin, Texas, right on the Louisiana border, not too far from it. But where Robert's at right now is actually in his wife's office, and Jenny is his bride, and where they're at, they raised two young boys and one old lab retriever. So with that, though, Robert, what I'm going to do is have you introduce Hallie and Parker tonight.
Thank you, Aaron. I appreciate it. We're all three of us are glad to be here today. We've got what we think some pretty unique studies going on the property, and I'm lucky enough. I got two of our students that one has finished her graduate work on the property, and then Hallie, and then Parker is currently doing his. So Hallie Halstead, she is a student at Texas A&M. She's in the Rangeland Wildlife and Fisheries Management Department, finishing up her research, focusing on factors influencing the diets of wild pigs in the Piney Woods region of Texas. And for her study, she examined stomach contents, fecal samples, and collected parasites from wild pigs to document their diet composition and assess abiotic and biotic factors possibly influencing changes in diets among wild pigs throughout the year. Really neat study. Great young woman. She's really good with a knife, by the way, but I've really enjoyed working with her. Our other student, current student, is Parker Trifoletti. He's a graduate student from Texas A&M Kingsville down in South Texas. His project is looking at how wildlife communities are influenced by management activities here at Boggy Slough Conservation Area. For the past year, his project involved a grid of 40 trail cameras spread across the property with different management histories. Really neat project. In addition to part of the study, he's more focused on whitetail deer. It involves using baited cameras to examine how deer respond to threats of coyotes and wild pigs. Really neat study. I think you'll enjoy hearing about both of these today. First off, a little bit about Boggy Slough. I want to tell everybody where we're located. We're in East Texas, about 2 miles north of Houston. We're a 19,000 acre continuous property, mixed pine forests, cover about 12,000 acres, and another 7,000 acres is totally bottomland habitat, bordered by 18 miles of the Neches River. So a very unique piece of property, very diverse piece of property, which has its challenges. And one of those today is we're going to talk about is our wild hog population and how we deal with that.
Good deal, Robert. Well,
Um,
I do appreciate it. Yeah, that's something that I think that this time of the year is much of a transitional period of the year. So we're going to see some changes, I guess, in dietary preferences and their habits and things like that. So you alluded to the Hallie's research looking more specifically into those food habit studies specific to the year and some of those pressures that may dictate that. But Hallie, if you would give us a snapshot of just overall the general observations that you made with wild pigs and their food preferences and habits.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you both for the introduction. But yeah, like Robert said, I've been looking at stomach contents and fecal samples, just seeing what pigs have been eating over the course of one full year. So to make sure to include every season. And I'm still in the middle of doing my analysis for my results, but so far, I found that their diets are less diverse when the temperatures get warmer. So in the summer into spring, they all start to seem to eat the same type of things. And then when we get to the colder months, they kind of get a little bit more diverse. So I'm interested to see, dig more into that to see if there's any other specific factors other than just the temperature playing into that. But what has been interesting is excluding any bait that was used for trapping purposes. They really seem to go after those grasses or sedges, and they love those acorns, especially in the winter. So those are things that we've had the highest frequency of occurrence so far. And another interesting thing I found so far is that we know pigs are hardy animals. That's why they're so hard to manage. But looking at their parasitic load, either through ticks or any internal parasites that they might have, it doesn't seem to influence their diet at all. So, usually if we're sick or if, cows get sick or have any parasites, they usually will change their diet or even their appetite, but it doesn't seem to affect the pigs in near the same way. So I thought that's been pretty interesting so far.
Yeah, good deal, Hallie. That's something I think it's worth noting there is that the observation that you made with regard to the summertime and those dietary preferences being really restricted during those warmer seasons. I mean, do you think that could be one associated with the weather, with the amount of moisture on the landscape, and then them having to hold closer to those watersheds, or could there be something else that may be influencing that?
Yeah, I could definitely see that being a big part of it. And if they're in a good, habitat where they don't even have to go far to find resources, I can also see where they would just kind of stay hunkered down and where they know they have food and water for those warmer months for sure.
Right. So that makes it pretty important to keep in mind where those water sources are whenever you're managing those animals in those warmer months is get close enough to that water without blowing them out of the area, but close enough that they're going to be in that vicinity of what you're trying to do. So and then Robert is, I mean, obviously she's conducted this study on Boggy, and during certain times of the year, I mean, how far do they range from the Neches River? And the Neches is pretty prone to flooding, but it can also get pretty dry too.
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's one thing I really want to cover. With Boggy Slough Conservation Area, when we have 18 miles of Neches River frontage, that the river fluctuates greatly within the year. Okay, we get a lot of rain here during. Well, let me say we get about anywhere from 55 to 75 inches of rain per year. So the river will flood and it will drop down. So, which when the river floods, it floods acres, thousands of acres of bottomland. And so, what that does, that'll push the wild pigs out of the bottomlands into the uplands, into new territory, and that's it's not just a challenge, but you can use that also as an advantage to locate them and trap them. That's what we do. But the river is a huge part of how the property works and how the not just wild hogs, but the white-tailed deer, everything, waterfowl. It has a huge part of the property, and it also affects food sources. We'll have we depend a lot on during the fall, lots of acorn mast for the white-tailed deer in the fall, and so do the hogs. And so when the river floods, it takes away a lot of that food, and that can really push them on to lots of our other areas that we're doing management on, where there's planting food plots. Some of our prescribed burning areas I'll talk about later on are affected by them. But anyway, the river is just a key point of how the property works.
Yeah, and that leads into another thought, Robert, too, is I mean, with those harder times of the summer, whenever it's warmer and less water on the landscape, is what do you see as far as riparian zone damage and the like that could cause some other challenges later in the year?
Yeah, so when it does get dry, and we're in a dry period right now, these hogs are going to be seeking out any standing water. Okay. There's still water in the river. They will go to the river, but all of our creek drainages, and we call them stream management zones between some of our tracts of timber that we manage, lots of damage in there because that's where the hogs are hanging out. They're eating everything they can find. They've got water. They're wallowing in the creeks, and so dry times, your water sources in dry areas tend to get really polluted, and that's an issue with us. With that said, this time of year is a good time if you wanted to trap some hogs. You just find water, and you will find hogs. And unfortunately, all that water, all the other wildlife are seeking out water too. So that pushes them all in. We've learned through many years that hogs and deer don't mix very well as any other species. So it's challenging, very challenging.
Yeah, and Robert, we're getting into the transitional time of the year right now where we start moving from that fall pattern and just trying to hold things constant to getting into the fall activities of hunting and some other, and I know that there'll be some food plots put in the ground, and based on soil moisture is when and how quickly they will, but and what those pigs can do regarding those food plots. But Hallie, one of those things that you had talked about in your opening comments about those preferences of those mast trees, those oaks and pecans and things like that, a lot of those food plot seeds are relatively large, and that's something to kind of think about too, Robert. I don't know if there's anything that you've noticed over the course of the years being there at Boggy with regard to those food plot mixes, if there's something that may be more or less impacted based off of that seed size and what's selected in that distribution of seed.
Yeah, so this time of year at Boggy Slough, we're beginning our mowing. We're beginning our fall food plot planting. And so we're disking up a lot of ground. There's no doubt you start disking ground, of course, the hogs smell that fresh ground dirt, and they're coming to it. And so when we disperse our seed, we get a lot of visitors. And if we don't get a rain pretty quick on that seed, we'll lose a lot of that to the hogs. Of course, your oats, they'll get eaten very quickly. Now your clovers and things like that tend to survive if they don't get buried too deep from the rooting. But yeah, that's this time of year is the time of year where we see a lot of damage from hogs in our food plots. That'll carry on. I'll cover it later on, but late winter and right now are our biggest times that we try to keep a watch on them. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, and then Hallie, one of the things you had talked about there in those food habit studies is relative to the forbs and to the sedges and so forth, and depending on what that plant is when it's going to germinate and when it's going to perform. And Robert, you like the core of who you are as a native deer manager, native landscape manager. And Hallie, what do we think about when we consider fall management with regard to pigs whenever it's on native habitat? I mean, how impactful are those pigs with regard to feeding on sedges and forbs and things like that's going to, I guess, potentially negatively influence those deer management strategies?
Right, yeah, that's the big question. There actually has not been a whole lot of research done on that side of it. There has been a whole bunch on the damage side, just of, pigs rooting and wallowing around, but not looking at the specifics from that damage, such as recovery rates from, plants they disturb or, food plots. There has been a lot of stuff on agriculture, specifically like corn. But yeah, that's part of my study. They were hoping to find some type of relationship with, their feeding habits during specific times of the year to see if there's a way to estimate how plants would react to them affecting them.
Right. And then other things that we found in research too is that, I mean, you're talking about plants that are native to the landscape, those forbs and sedges and grasses that are native there that have evolved here to a certain soil type or fertility level, when we know that disturbed soil over a period of time typically is lower in fertility, deeper or shallower in a desirable profile and so forth. So then we consider the possibilities of an increase of non-natives or invasives or something of that nature that we really don't want on that landscape, or not in the quantities that they are. So other thoughts that come into to consideration here, Ali, is that in the fall of the year, as we move into that hunting period, is the influence that either one way or the other. What if you're using corn to get those deer to come to an area, or you've got a elevated amount of acorns in an area and just eating up all of your corn. What do you see with a selection, I guess, a pig selection on habitat type? Is there something at certain times of the year that they prefer over others? I mean, that's if there's a good mass production, yeah, we know that they're going to be coming to those acorns. But if there's not a mass production, what do you see as a possibility that they could impact if that mass is not available?
Well, if you have corn on the ground, they will definitely go eat it. I think we're all pretty aware of that. But other than that, I haven't seen yet, at least, any real positive trend, other than those mast and acorns that we kind of already know about, and then those grasses in the warmer months. There was a slight spike of I found invertebrates, mainly moth larvae, in the fall months. So that was pretty interesting. It almost seemed like they had sought those out. So that's been pretty interesting on my end so far.
Yeah, that's something I think is very telling too. It's a good point that you draw, that certain places around the country right now are much better off condition wise than they typically are. I know where we're at in Southeast Texas, it's a lot greener now than what it typically is. I know that it wasn't just a week or so ago, I was in Southeast in northern Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas, where literally ditches were level top with water. And what that's obviously going to do, Hallie, is what you just alluded to. A lot of the invertebrates are going to be pushed to the top of the ground, and then pushing it to the top of the ground, or even, Robert, later on, it may be in that leaf litter where they're at, and they're really working on some of those areas that could carry that fire. So that's going to be, I guess, leading into some of those land usage activities, is if you've got those higher amounts of rainfall and changing those dietary preferences based on what's available. How often do you see impairments to your roadways or your infrastructure and things like that imposed by pigs?
So, yeah, I want to hit on that a little bit. At Boggy Slough, we're either, a lot of our management activities include harvesting timber. We're doing that this time of year. We burn about a third of the property every year, so about 6,500 acres of prescribed fire on the landscape. That's one of our biggest, if not biggest, land management tool we have is prescribed fire. And as a forester, I spend a lot of time in the woods. I'm either marking timber or mapping out some other areas for some other prescriptions. And I've noticed, especially with our prescribed burning, that our hog populations, get so high in certain areas that they'll root areas that will actually stop a prescribed fire. And what that is we burn so much on Boggy Slough that we may not have leaf litter as thick as some areas, okay, because we use that tool to control the understory. Well, if we're on a 2-year burn schedule and a sounder of hogs, 20 hogs come through in roots, up 60 or 50, 60, 100 acres of a line, that'll stop a fire. And believe me, that when a fire stopped like that, it doesn't continue to carry. It doesn't do its job. The past 2 years we've really seen a problem with that, and that doesn't mention like you say, tearing up roads and things like that. But as far as I really want to hit on that, people think that prescribed fire is great, but if you can't get that fire to carry through the woods, you're not going to do any good.
Yeah, I think that's something we need to keep in mind just as the fall and the early winter roll around, that we may have gotten a lot of rain in the summer and the fall. It's got plenty of fuel in place, but those pigs can come in there and just destroy that possibility of that fuel to carry that fire where we want it to in the late winter, early spring part of the year. And I guess more, Robert, is whenever we start thinking about right now with the focus shifting to those hunting seasons and much more in the field activities, is how do you see there on Boggy pigs affecting movement of other wildlife and specifically the deer?
Okay. So this time of year, we've been blessed with a lot of rain and things are still green, but a lot of this, some of the grasses and forbs that they're feeding on, they're pretty rank. And so now when our hunters are putting out corn feeders and planting food plots, it's going to be an immediate attraction. And most of our corn feeders are pinned. And all of our one part of the property we do feed protein, and they're all pinned. But we've noticed that if those feeders aren't pinned, they just become a hog magnet, and deer will not visit those feeders. Even we even left some feeders unpinned on purpose so we could have hunters target hogs, and that works good for a while. But they're not dumb. They go nocturnal very quickly. So we try to pin all our feeders, and we tell all our hunters to shoot hogs on site. And that works good for a while, like I say, and we get some good numbers through our hunters, but they eventually go totally nocturnal, and you think, oh, I got all the hogs, we're doing good. Well, really, you're not. You just educated them. And so that's when our trapping starts up in January through about May. And I can hit on that when the time's right. But hunting deer and hogs just have really, we have harvest goals that we've got to meet every year. And if we don't meet those harvest goals on our white-tailed deer, that's an issue. So hogs have hurt us on that end of the deal as well.
Yeah, that's something that's a concern, I think, regardless of the landscape type that you have, is that there's some species that will tolerate one another, but there's not many species out there that tolerates a pig.
Yeah.
They don't interact too well. And I think that's something that we need to think about now, kind of moving into what Parker has worked on for a while there with the sounder dynamics and the interactions is that, I guess, Parker, just kind of give us again, snapshot of what you looked at with regard to your camera studies and the videos and how those sounders interact throughout the course of a year.
Yeah. So the first part of this project has been kind of a passive camera grid so that we could collect information on all different types of animals through a multitude of seasons. And so something we saw with the pigs regarding the pigs from that is about their activity across seasons. So we saw the lowest number of pigs during the summer when it's hot and dry. And then within that season, near water in those bottomlands were those pig hotspots. And then we saw the detections increase pretty sharply into the fall as the temperature dropped. And then as kind of we started to get more rainstorms, that spiked pig activity too. When we had those big rainstorms in the winter and in the spring, we saw so many more pigs during the rain, during that flooded period, and then it would just drop off again once it started to dry up. And then kind of in terms of the sounder dynamics, we got pictures of piglets all year, but definitely the spring seemed like when we saw the most nursing age piglets. And then this kind of second part of the project that we're running right now involves baiting cameras. And we have a speaker that's playing a sound when the camera's triggered. So we're focused on deer, trying to see what scares deer. We're using coyotes and the sounds of pigs. But we're still getting pigs at the corn bait. Plenty. So one thing that we're kind of seeing is that the sounders and younger piglets are hardly scared by anything, and they'll just camp out on a bait pile all night. They'll sleep there while the sounds of coyotes are being blasted on them. They really are not bothered. They habituate very quickly. They figure out the bait's there very quickly. And it's kind of the boars that we're seeing a little bit different behavior, that they tend to be a bit more skittish, and they'll kind of come and go at the bait pile, and they'll often run the first time they hear a coyote or a pig sound. And the deer can actually kind of get into the bait a little bit better when a boar is showing up, because he'll come and go as opposed to a whole sounder that's just going to camp out there because it figured out that you're going to bait this thing every day and provide an infinite food source for them.
Yeah, very excellent points on there. And I think this is something that's very valid to point out, is what you just described. A perfect correlation to what Hallie's research was showing is that in the summertime of the year, warmer months, that those dietary preferences were much more, I guess, diverse, because they did not want to move from that water, those softer landscapes, because there was no water where they wanted to go. So very much a correlation there to the camera findings that you've seen, is that they're holding tighter to that water. So I think that's a very good point to draw out. The other thing I think it's worth mentioning in there as well is that whenever we do have those heightened periods of the years, those spikes of the year where you saw those nursing age pigs, is those management strategies need to adjust as such, because whenever those females have pigs on side, nursing age pigs on side, or they're heavier bred, they're much less tolerant of those boars. So it may be that that you've got those females in the area that have a lot of pigs on side, and you just can't figure out why that they won't pattern. And many times what we see is just because you have those boars that they know it's not that breeding time of the year, and they're not really pushing those females around too much, but they're holding to a certain landscape type, which may have a bait site in it. And those females don't want to bring those little ones around there just because of that interaction. So, and I guess the final point is that Parker, whenever we start thinking about the fall of the year and these weather fronts blowing through, whenever we've got these rain events and such like that, those pig movements, from what I'm understanding, from what you're seeing, is that they may shift their movement patterns substantially during those weather pattern shifts.
Yeah, it really seemed like when we were getting big storms, when the temperature drops, the moisture increases, the pigs are going to be more active day and night. And we saw deer too kind of have that same response. So you're increasing your chances of pigs kind of having interactions with all these other species too, as they're increasing their movements.
Yeah. And then Robert, I guess I've got a question, just as far as just an observation there at Boggy, is that whenever these weather patterns do come through in the fall of the year, if you've got any mass production at all, do you see any shifts in movement whenever you have a big wind come through and knock a lot of acorns down on the ground?
No, for sure. Massed affects all game movement, especially hogs. So it really distributes the wild hogs across the property, and makes them hard to locate, which kind of gives relief, I guess, to some hunting sites, but they're definitely scatters them across the landscape, and especially the deer as well. But that's the only time during the year that we see less visits from hogs to corn feeders. When there's a heavy acorn crop, the hogs tend to, you're like, oh, this is great. There's no hog coming to my corn feeder. Well, guess what? There's no deer coming either, just because they're all
Right.
eating acorns. But yeah, and it really spreads them across the landscape. And you think, and to me, I'm kind of naive. Every year, I'm like, oh, I'm doing great on my hogs, and then a month later, when all the acorns are gone or they've rotten from the river flooding, here come the hogs again.
Yeah, yeah, and that's something we see pretty much just about anywhere there's any kind of a mass production, and in that time, what is typically the recommended approach on that is not forcing the issue, because when there's plenty of steaks on the ground, nobody wants a sliced sandwich of some kind. I mean, there's plenty to eat, so we typically can have those spikes during the fall of the year whenever bait leverage is just non-existent. And whenever we start thinking about management strategies and such, not forcing the issue is the phrase of the day, because in those times of ample nutrition, and you try to force an issue with a pig being very, very intelligent, you can make a situation far worse. That's one of those times that we really have to pump the brakes rather than panic and think about, well, if we had those pigs responding the way that we wanted them to, the way that they were making themselves easier to manage, and then all of a sudden they've hit the brakes, then before we panic and throw everything at them under the sun, we need to think about why they've shifted patterns, shifted their preferences and such like that. So I don't know if you got anything else to add to that, but it's something I think is a consistency regardless of the landscape type, just those natural food availabilities.
Right. No, I'll add a little bit. Boggy Slough, we're lucky enough to have a lot of oak species available on the landscape, which is great wildlife food. There's a lot of properties in this area of East Texas that is just solid pine plantation with no hardwoods within it, which means less browse, usually less browse, and of course way less acorn mass. And so those areas, your hogs will continue to focus on food plots and feeders, and probably won't distribute across the landscape as much. Even though I will say that, we've got some hogs that we have different color phases here. And I was actually hunting with my son one time, my youngest one, and a light colored hog came out and he shot and missed it, but it ran a mile to where my other son was hunting at a feeder and he killed it. So these hogs will travel a long ways. It doesn't matter, I don't just because I'm hunting in a pine plantation and there's a hog here, it doesn't mean he's staying there. He's going to travel to go to the food sources, as we know. So anyway, very, they can adapt to anything. It's pretty amazing. I'm still amazed. I've been messing with these critters for 25, 30 years. So.
Yeah, and then Parker, I guess the question for you is just on your observations of those sounder movements and such. Have you seen a shift in the movement patterns relative to moving during the daylight or the dark or at night throughout the course of a year?
They seem generally not more nocturnal overall, and that especially in the summer, and it seemed especially in those kind of open fields and food plots, they were pretty strictly nocturnal, and that it was more when they had more cover in the bottomlands where it's cooler is where they're moving around more during the day. That you're not going to see them too much out in the middle of a field at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when it's 95 degrees out.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's something we can keep in mind too, is that like what Robert's talking about, whenever you have some of the folks that are setting in a deer blind, and every time a pig walks to a feeder, they get shot at, and they associate that feeder with danger, then they can shift those movement patterns to almost exclusively nocturnal, which I guess drives the next question or the next point to discuss is that whenever we're talking about managing the land in the fall, is whenever you're, I guess, educating to some degree those pigs at those feeders where they habituate to the nighttime movements quickly, then dedicated management strategies should not fall within a given area around those food sources like feeders. So Robert, whenever you are looking at management strategies for bigger numbers, what do you consider in the fall of the year that may be different than other times of the year in proximity to those feed locations?
So explain your question a little bit more so I answer it
Yeah,
right
I mean,
there.
what we see is that quite frequently that people see pigs on their cameras, their game cameras in the fall of the year, coming to those deer feeders and quickly put up pig traps and focus those management strategies around those deer feeders, and then the successes are not what they thought they would be. Those animals are quickly habituated to that site and associated with damage or danger. So what the efficient way of management in the fall of the year very well could be that we don't associate pig management with the feeders and those food sites.
Yeah, no, you're right. I relate to our trapping program. We've, just to give you a number, in the past 8 years, just to give you a number, we've removed, over 4,700 hogs in the past 8 years on about 19,000 acres. So hogs get very used to traps. They get used to feeders. And so, it goes without saying. So, we trap in areas, and, we don't trap in the areas we hunt. We trap in areas kind of off to the kind of where there's no deer blinds around. We do a lot of pre-baiting, get them very used to those sites before we even set a trap. So we use more corn as our main thing we use to bait with, but we use more corn pre-baiting than we do actually trapping, because we want to get as many in that trap as we can. So we have 8 permanent traps on the property. Okay. And we'll pre-bait those traps for about a month before we even set them. Okay. And those are the old school permanent traps. You can catch hogs in them for a little bit, and then you have to start pre-baiting for another month. Now, the pig Brig trap that we're currently using for our research is, of course, a different story. You can continue catching them a lot faster with that. But, hogs it just comes down to it. Hogs have a better nose than deer, I'm convinced. They don't think the same as a deer, but they're very intelligent. You've got to have somebody in charge of your trapping program that really understands them and understands how they travel as well. I think we are lucky. I hit on it a little bit earlier. When the river floods, and it floods a third of the property, a lot of those hogs are going to move into territories that they're not really used to. The water pushes them out, and that's a key time that we use to trap hogs. And there's a lot of properties in East Texas that have the same scenario as we do. Exactly. And there's lots of big creeks. Rivers flood out of their banks, so that is a key time to make sure. And I'm talking setting your traps in the uplands where it pushes the hogs out of the river bottom into the uplands. Key time to trap, no doubt about it. That's when we get our best success.
Yeah, I guess one of the final thoughts on the fall management and such for the spring is what do you see, or do you see any impacts at all from feral pigs on the regeneration of the timber that's there on Boggy? Have you seen any changes in the vegetation types and in the seedling regeneration?
You can see that, yes. So we planted, we had about 70 acres of longleaf we planted a couple of years ago. And doing survival checks, we did notice quite a bit of hog damage in there, some rooting going on. I think the little plugs, the plugs are fertilized. They must taste better. The root must taste better than any other, other root out there. So yes, they love rooting those little plugs up and eating them. You bet they do.
Yeah, so it's going to be pretty imperative that if you know that there's places that you're going to try to plant, then you need to really focus some serious pig management prior to that planting phase.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's the other thought that I guess it will wrap up with there is just on the management strategies and in the fall of the year. And I mean, depending on what your native food supplies are, your natural food supplies, the abundance, the quality and such is going to heavily impact what you can do and when you can do it. Just because we don't want to handicap ourselves with trying to force pigs to a bait site or to a trap site when there's ample nutrition that's there that they would select. So being ever vigilant on the landscape is going to be a major guiding point to determining success in the fall of the year and how effective you are at moving those pigs off the landscape. So I guess, and then what we in the also too, I guess Hallie will give you an open mic here too to any thoughts that you've got as far as implications of what you're seeing and how we should be managing the pigs throughout the course of the year, maybe not just in the fall. What do we need to focus on?
Well, I go ahead, Hallie.
No, you probably have more to say.
I just want to say that, you know, for a small property, for a large property, there's lots of tools in the toolbox, and you've got to stay very resilient the way you control hogs. You've got to be able to read the landscape and know where they're going at this time of the year, and know, say, okay, last year I had problems here. I'm gonna concentrate on that, but it's just a moving target, and you've got to be able to read the landscape. It's not as difficult as you think. But if you can control hog numbers at certain times of the year before certain management, such as planting, such as prescribed burning, such as food planting, food plots, if you can stay on them or concentrate heavy trapping in some areas before, it makes a huge difference. And I just want to hit on one more thing. We had a student, a turkey project going on. We had some transmitters on some turkeys on the property, and he was tracking them. And you know, you've got to understand with as many hogs on the landscape now, when a turkey hen has to sit on the ground for 28 days to incubate eggs, that's a lot of time. And in Boggy Slough, I think something's going to have to be really lucky to survive 28 days on the ground without a hog passing by and taking, advantage of that. So things like that before nesting, before planting, I think you have to hit on them, because you're not ever going to remove them, I don't think, from the landscape, but you can really work on hitting them when it's important.
Yeah, and I think that's something that Hallie will probably be able to identify with the analysis of what she's looked at, is at certain times of the year, whenever there's more desirable foods that are there, those peaks of the year, and during those valleys of when that natural food is not available, that may be, Robert, what we need to think about focusing our management strategies, and instead of keeping the gas pedal down on those pigs all year long and taking the chance on educating them, when are those peaks and valleys? And that, like you said, is something that you're going to have to learn to read your landscape and adapt accordingly.
100%. I think that's the strategy we're going to take. And, I'm not saying we've been totally successful, but with a little bit of your help and advice and from others. But I have to say, having these two students on today, it doesn't matter how long I've been in East Texas most of my life, having true research about what's going on out there, not just seeing it with your own eyes, but true research is going to be key to understanding these our problems we're having.
Right. And I guess then, Parker, let us know a little bit of idea when you think the timeline's going to be for your second assessment there on how those deer reply to or respond to those sounds, because I know we've got a lot of people that are tuning in that are in the fall of the year, and they kind of get a little different opinion about certain pigs, coyotes, and whatnot on their deer movement.
Yeah, I can say from kind of the initial things that we're seeing that deer are running from pigs and coyotes at a pretty similar rate. So that even just, and we're not using kind of sounds of pigs in distress or anything. It's all snorting, grunting, kind of eating sounds. So just neutral, a pig being present type sounds. And that's bothering deer. They're running off from that. So it seems like even just the idea of a pig is enough to scare deer away and affect how kind of they're moving and what areas they're using.
Right. Well, I think that something's going to be very well worth coming back and visiting with each of you whenever there's the analysis point is been conducted, wrapped up to know what there's some solid information on. So definitely we're interested and would like to know more about what your final conclusions are. So
I have had a slight peek into some of my other parts of data I'm looking at. It does seem that those sounders that were trapped together, there was definitely a difference in diets between like the adults versus the juveniles. And so I'm not sure if that's just naivety from the juveniles not knowing what to eat, or if the adults are like overtaking the good stuff and kind of pushing out the juveniles out of the way. So that's going to be interesting to dig more into as I go.
yeah, that's very interesting. And then the other thought is too is that Parker, something that I think has probably come up where will come up more so on the analysis is that when we think about the summertime movement patterns and what those pigs do and how they perform, a lot of times I get asked the question is, well, how long is it going to take to condition pigs to a site? And the answer is I don't know, because pigs never read the script. But one of the things that we need to keep in mind is the digestive process of those pigs and their inability to sweat. So whenever those animals heavily consume any food source or whatnot, just because of metabolic temperature increases, and the inability to sweat is guiding them to do a lot more feeding later in the night. That way, with as rapid as their digestive systems is, digestive processes, they can have that temperature spike just from metabolic processes over and done by daylight. So sometimes we'll see those pigs that typically throughout 8 months of the year may stir in the daytime to feed, will shift their movement patterns from and with no pressure induced, just move those movement patterns to later at night whenever they can have that digestion taken care of and that temperature, their body temperature spike over and done by daybreak. So whenever we think about some of those tendencies, it may be that we need to think about in the summertime, like right now, shifting the baiting of those traps and those bait sites so we can avoid some of that non-target interference. Those deer and raccoons and turkeys, if you've got them in those areas, are going to still continue to feed when they typically do. And you've got an animal that already has challenges at regulating body temperature. They're not going to enhance that deficiency by feeding in the daytime whenever they know their body temperature is going to go up during metabolism. So something to think about moving forward in those baiting sites and baiting traps and things like that is it may need to be a little bit later in the afternoon, or if you're using a feeder to condition pigs to a location, program those feeders to spin that feed out a little bit later in the evening than what typically is done.
Perfect. Well, if y'all don't have anything else, I think that'll be all.
I do appreciate it.
Well, yeah, Aaron, thank you for having us, and I appreciate you, Parker and Hallie. Thanks a bunch.
Absolutely,
Yes,
Parker and Hallie. Anything we can do to help out or open up some places that we need to do a little more research, definitely let us know. All right. Well, y'all have a good evening and be safe.